Gaslighting, a term rooted in the 1944 film Gaslight, but clinically defined by psychologist Robin Stern, operates not as simple disagreement, but as a systematic dismantling of another's grasp on reality. To understand it through the journalistic lens of 5W plus 1H, who engages in it? Typically someone in a position of perceived authority, a manager, colleague, or even a peer leveraging insecurity who seeks control without overt confrontation. What is it? It is the deliberate distortion of facts, memories, or perceptions to induce self-doubt, transforming objective events into subjective confusion. When does it occur? Not in dramatic clashes, but during routine interactions, a project deadline always being Friday, despite shared Monday agreements, or feedback dismissed as misinterpreted when documented evidence exists. Where does it manifest? Primarily in environments where power imbalances are normalized, like offices where hierarchy discourages questioning, turning conference rooms or Slack threads into arenas of quiet coercion. Why is it employed? To cultivate dependence. By eroding confidence in one's own judgment, the gaslighter ensures compliance becomes easier than resistance, conserving their authority with minimal effort. How does it work? Through incremental denials like, "I never said that," trivialization, "you're overreacting," and manufactured confusion like, "Recheck your notes, yours must be wrong." The person exploits the human tendency to seek external validation when internal certainty wavers. Historically, such tactics have echoed beyond individual workplaces, from Soviet-era Zakluchiony reports pathologizing dissenters to corporate cover-ups that reframed ethical concerns as personality conflicts. Michel Foucault's analysis of power as embedded in everyday discourse reveals how gaslighting thrives not through force, but by hijacking the language of reason itself, making the victim complicit in their own disorientation. For the office worker, this manifests as a creeping unease, double-checking emails obsessively, hesitating to voice ideas, or feeling crazy for trusting their own eyes. Recognizing this pattern demands historical humility. We are not the first to navigate such manipulations, and acknowledges that certainty is fragile in systems designed to obscure truth. Yet agency persists in the mundane, saving meeting recordings, seeking third-party perspectives, or simply naming the tactic when safe. It is not about winning, but preserving the right to interpret one's experience. As philosopher Karl Popper warned, the defense of open societies begins with vigilance against the distortion of reality. There are no guarantees against manipulation, only the cautious possibility that by documenting, reflecting, and connecting with others, we might reclaim small territories of trust. The responsibility lies not in solitary heroism, but in the quiet, persistent refusal to outsource our perception of what is real.
The purpose is not to win an argument, but to break your reality. This is not merely manipulation in the tactical sense, correcting a misstatement or steering a conversation, but a deeper, more insidious project, the erosion of one's confidence in their own mind. In the workplace, this often unfolds subtly. A manager dismisses your recollection of a meeting, insisting you misunderstood instructions, even when notes suggest otherwise. A colleague reframes your contribution in a way that makes you question whether you said it at all. Over time, these small dissonances accumulate, not as isolated incidents, but as a slow recalibration of what feels real. The gaslighter, as clinical psychologist Robin Stern named the phenomenon in her work on emotional manipulation, doesn't need to dominate every exchange, only to plant enough doubt so that you begin policing your own thoughts before speaking. It becomes less about being right and more about surviving the interaction with some fragment of self-trust intact. Historically, such tactics have been wielded not just in personal relationships, but in political and institutional control, from totalitarian regimes rewriting history to corporate cultures silencing dissent by pathologizing concern. Michel Foucault's insights into power as something embedded in language and accepted norms help illuminate how authority can reshape perception without overt coercion. What makes gaslighting particularly dangerous in professional settings is its camouflage. It often wears the mask of efficiency, teamwork, or high standards. You're told you're too sensitive or not a team player, not because you disagree, but because you remember differently. And in that gap between memory and revision, autonomy begins to fray. There is no dramatic rupture, only a quiet surrender to someone else's narrative. Yet recognizing this pattern is itself an act of resistance. It does not restore certainty, because certainty, especially in complex human systems, may be illusory, but it reopens space for inquiry. One begins to ask, not, "Am I wrong?" but "Why does this keep happening?" That shift, as small as it may seem, reintroduces agency. It acknowledges that while we are shaped by structures larger than ourselves, we are not entirely determined by them. The possibility then emerges not of winning arguments, but of reclaiming the right to perceive, interpret, and speak. That possibility is fragile, contingent, and demands constant vigilance, but it is ours to steward.
The voiceover's purpose is to be calm, soothing narrative that makes historical topics relaxing and suitable for sleep. It often comes wrapped in a compliment or the language of support, which is what makes it so difficult to resist. In the quiet hum of an open-plan office, during a one-on-one meeting, or even over a casual coffee refill, feedback that feels off is softened with phrases like, "I'm saying this because I genuinely want to see you succeed," or "You're so capable, this shouldn't be that hard for someone like you." These statements don't arrive as attacks. They come cloaked in encouragement, making it nearly impossible to object without seeming defensive or insecure. The result is a subtle shift. Instead of evaluating the appropriateness of the comment, you begin to scrutinize your own response. Did I overreact? Am I not resilient enough? This internal recalibration mirrors what philosopher Miranda Fricker identified as hermeneutical injustice, when individuals lack the interpretive resources to make sense of their own experiences, especially when power-laden narratives systematically obscure those experiences. In the workplace, such dynamics are not new. hierarchical structures who've long relied on implicit norms where subordinates are expected to absorb criticism gracefully, regardless of tone or context. What's changed is the vocabulary. Today's management culture prizes emotional intelligence and mentorship, yet these ideals can be co-opted to deliver pressure under the guise of care. Consider the manager who frames excessive workloads as a sign of trust. I give you more because you're the only one I can count on. The compliment masks an imbalance, and to question it risks being labeled ungrateful or weak. Over time, this erodes not just confidence, but clarity. One begins to doubt perceptions that once felt reliable. Psychologist Carol Tavris has noted how cognitive dissonance thrives in such conditions, where contradictory messages create mental friction that people resolve by altering their self-view rather than challenging the source. Historically, similar patterns emerged in industrial workplaces, repackaged now for the knowledge economy. Recognizing this requires more than awareness. It demands a conscious exercise of agency. It means pausing after a conversation that left you unsettled, not to rehearse self-corrections, but to ask, was the intent truly supportive, or was support the vehicle for control? There is no definitive formula for answering this, only the ongoing practice of reflection, dialogue, and, when possible, collective validation. In that uncertainty lies both vulnerability and possibility.
The conference room feels unnaturally cold as you leave, palms damp despite the controlled climate, replaying how your voice tightened when your supervisor noted, "Your defensiveness tells me you're not ready for this role." This moment crystallizes a pernicious pattern. Your visible frustration, perhaps a clipped reply or a momentary pause to steady your breath, becomes not a human reaction to disorienting communication, but evidence of your supposed instability. The gaslighter subtly engineered the provocation. Vague accusations, shifting expectations, or dismissive tones, then points to your resulting stress as justification for their behavior, framing your emotional response as the core problem. It is a self-fulfilling prophecy disguised as objectivity, where the act of questioning the interaction proves its necessity. Historically, such tactics echo broader societal mechanisms of control. Mid-20th century sociologists like Irving Goffman observed how labels like hysterical or irrational were systematically applied to marginalized voices, particularly women, to discredit dissent, a practice repackaged in modern offices as unprofessionalism when an employee expresses justified frustration over unclear deadlines or unreasonable demands. Consider the colleague who insists you take things too personally after criticizing your work in front of others. Your subsequent withdrawal or quiet correction is then cited as proof of your sensitivity, obscuring the initial breach of professional conduct. This inversion relies on ambiguity, exploiting the workplace norm that equates emotional restraint with competence. Philosopher Kate Abramson notes how gaslighting weaponizes societal expectations, making victims internalize blame for reactions that would be rational in any context, like feeling flustered after being told contradictory instructions twice in one day. The true injury lies not just in the act, but in the enforced solitude of doubt in your own perception. Recognizing this demands historical awareness. These dynamics thrive where power avoids accountability by pathologizing resistance. Yet agency exists in the quiet act of naming the pattern. It means acknowledging, this isn't about my tears. It's about the pressure to deny them while the problem remains unnamed. There is no grand confrontation required, only the deliberate choice, in the elevator or at your desk, to separate your human response from the manufactured narrative of your inadequacy. In that distinction, however fragile, lies the first step towards reclaiming interpretive authority, one uncertain but necessary observation at a time.
The phrase arrives not as an accusation, but a diagnosis. You're too sensitive. Delivered in a team huddle after a colleague dismisses your suggestion with a sigh, or appended to an email criticizing your report, it functions as a linguistic trapdoor, collapsing the space between their action and your reaction. Suddenly, the issue isn't the condescending tone or the vague shifting expectations, but your supposed inability to withstand routine professional friction. This reframing feels familiar, almost mundane, like a flickering fluorescent light everyone ignores until it strains your eyes. The problem, you're told, isn't the light, but your vision. In that moment, you find yourself mentally replaying your words, searching for proof you were oversensitive. Did your voice rise? Was your email too direct? While the original provocation dissolves into background noise. Historically, this tactic mirrors what sociologist Arlie Hochschild termed emotional labor, where workers, particularly women and minorities, are expected to absorb disrespect while maintaining composure, their natural responses pathologized as instability. Victorian-era physicians once labeled women's dissent as hysteria. Today, too sensitive serves a similar purpose in knowledge economies, deflecting accountability by recasting systemic issues, poor communication, unclear goals as individual character flaws. Philosopher Kate Abramson observes how such language enacts testimonial injustice, systematically eroding credibility by framing valid emotional responses as evidence of unreliability. Consider the project manager who insists deadlines are flexible, yet chastises you for missing one and then cites your frustration as proof you can't handle pressure. The phrase becomes a universal key unlocking any door to avoid examining their own behavior. What unsettles most is the quiet complicity of modern workplace norms that equate emotional restraint with professionalism, making self-doubt feel like a necessary survival skill. Yet agency emerges not in grand defiance, but in mundane acts of documentation, saving that curt email, noting the context in a private log, or voicing calmly, I hear you calling my reaction sensitivity. Can we discuss what specifically triggered it? This isn't about winning arguments, but reclaiming narrative ground. There's no certainty in these moments, only the slow, deliberate choice to question why certain reactions are deemed sensitive while others like dismissiveness or vagueness are normalized as leadership. In that questioning, however fragile, lies a refusal to let the gaslighter's key fit every lock.
The slow erosion begins not with a crash, but with a whisper. A missed deadline attributed to your poor communication when the calendar invite was never sent. A promised resource suddenly never discussed. The gradual fading of your confidence in recalling basic facts. Like the unnoticed decline of a desk plant whose soil dries over weeks until the leaves curl yellow, gaslighting operates through cumulative micro-invalidations, so small they feel unworthy of mention. A supervisor's offhand, I never said that, after a clear directive, or a colleague reframing your documented concern as overly emotional. Each instance is plausible in isolation, a miscommunication, a faulty memory. Yet together they form a pattern as insidious as salt corrosion on steel, weakening structural integrity without visible rupture. Historically, such tactics echo industrial-era management practices, where workers' timekeeping disputes were dismissed as faulty recollection against the infallible factory clock, a precedent for modern knowledge work, where digital records paradoxically amplify ambiguity. As organizational psychologist Adam Grant notes, micro-invalidations thrive in environments where power obscures accountability, transforming routine collaboration into a minefield of second-guessing. Consider the project where scope shifts occur via fragmented Slack messages, leaving you questioning whether the revised deadline was verbal or implied, until your frustration at the moving goalposts becomes proof of unreliability. This mirrors philosopher Hannah Arendt's observation about totalitarianism's reliance on organized lying, where truth dissolves not through grand falsehoods, but relentless mundane distortions that fracture collective reality. The true danger lies in the self-enforced silence. You dismiss your unease as hypersensitivity because no single incident warrants confrontation, much like ignoring a dripping tap until the ceiling stains. Yet agency emerges in the quiet discipline of documentation, not as ammunition, but as an anchor against disorientation. Saving email chains, time-stamping agreements, or even a private log of "I understood X" on date reclaims cognitive sovereignty, however modestly. There is no triumphant reversal here, only the persistent choice to honor your perception when evidence feels slippery. History reminds us that oppressive systems depend on normalized doubt. Conversely, resistance often lives in mundane acts of witness, in the gap between what was said and what is remembered, between the drip and the flood. Human agency resides not in certainty, but in the refusal to outsource one's truth, even when the only audience is oneself. The slow drip may persist, but so does the choice to measure it, drop by drop.
The spreadsheet glows under fluorescent lights as you adjust column widths for the third time, ensuring every figure aligns perfectly, a habit born of years managing complex budgets. Your manager's email arrives. Your rigidity is slowing the team. Focus on outcomes, not pixel-perfect formatting. What was once a praised strength, meticulous attention to detail, now framed as an obstacle. This inversion isn't accidental. Gaslighters systematically recast virtues as liabilities. Empathy becomes oversensitivity. Thoroughness, obsessiveness, calm deliberation, indecisiveness. The tactic exploits workplace norms that valorize certain traits, decisiveness, big-picture thinking, while pathologizing others, particularly those stereotypically associated with feminized labor. Historically, this mirrors Frederick Winslow Taylor's early 20th century scientific management, which dismissed workers' contextual knowledge as irrational in favor of standardized, top-down efficiency.
a legacy now repackaged in modern performance metrics that punish nuance. When your collaborative approach is labeled needy or your careful planning unambitious, it echoes sociologist Arlie Hochschild's observation that emotional labor is often punished when it doesn't serve managerial convenience. Consider the project lead whose inclusive meetings are criticized as time-wasting, then held accountable when siloed teams miss critical dependencies. The gaslighter doesn't invent these distortions. They weaponize existing cultural biases, making the attack feel like objective feedback. This creates a quiet crisis of self-trust. You begin avoiding color-coding cells or hesitating to voice concerns, internalizing the message that your natural instincts are flaws. Philosopher Martha Nussbaum notes how such tactics sever the link between competence and self-worth, particularly for women and minorities historically conditioned to doubt their professional instincts. What unsettles most is the lack of malice. The perpetrator may genuinely believe they're reframing, revealing how systemic biases operate through unconscious complicity. Agency here isn't about confrontation, but conscious reclamation. It means noting when too emotional follows your refusal to absorb disrespect, or when missing the big picture dismisses necessary risk assessment. You might quietly reframe your own language, precision-focused instead of rigid, relationship builder instead of needy. This isn't self-deception, but strategic truth-telling, a practice sociologist Patricia Hill Collins calls reclaiming the knowledge of lived experience. History shows these patterns persist, not because strengths are inherently problematic, but because rigid systems punish deviation from narrow ideals of productivity. There is no clean resolution, only the daily choice to honor your instincts while navigating structures that reward conformity. In this space between rigid and meticulous, between emotional and empathetic, lies the subtle act of resistance, refusing to let others define the value of your mind. The work isn't to become less detail-oriented, but to recognize that the problem lives not in your precision, but in systems too brittle to accommodate it.
The phrase, "I don't remember that," lands softly, almost apologetically. Delivered across a conference table while reviewing project timelines, or appended to an email denying a prior agreement, it carries the weight of finality, disguised as forgetfulness. This isn't mere oversight, it's a calibrated maneuver exploiting the unspoken contract of workplace civility. You know the calendar invite exists, the Slack message is archived, yet naming the discrepancy risks seeming petty or aggressive in a culture that equates directness with unprofessionalism. Historically, such tactics mirror the gentleman's agreement era of 19th century commerce, where verbal promises held legal force precisely because denying them violated rigid codes of honor. Today, that same trust is weaponized, as modern workplaces uphold politeness norms while discarding their ethical backbone. When a supervisor claims, "I never approved that budget," despite your documented request, the lie functions not through boldness, but through the quiet assumption that you'll prioritize harmony over truth. A gamble rooted in sociology's observation of how power leverages social capital. Irving Goffman's work on face-saving rituals illuminates this. By framing denial as mere forgetfulness, the gaslighter preserves their professional face while forcing you to choose between your integrity and social standing. The true cost manifests in mundane moments.
hesitating to resend a forgotten deadline, deleting a draft email that says, "per our conversation," or absorbing extra work rather than making a fuss. Over time, this corrodes not just trust in others, but in your own recollection. A phenomenon psychologist Elizabeth Loftus has documented in how repeated suggestion alters memory. Yet agency emerges in subtle recalibrations. It might mean shifting communication to written channels preemptively, to confirm our chat, I'll summarize next steps here. Or calmly reframing the dynamic. I recall it differently. Let's check the shared doc to align. This isn't about winning, but about refusing to let ambiguity become your burden. Historically, marginalized groups have navigated similar erasures through communal record-keeping, from enslaved people's oral histories to labor unions' strike logs. In today's office, the equivalent is mundane yet radical, the deliberate act of preserving evidence not as ammunition, but as a tether to reality. There's no certainty in these exchanges, only the quiet resolve to document when memory becomes contested terrain. The power of "I don't remember" lies in its plausibility. The counter lies not in accusation, but in the steady accumulation of facts that rendered plausible deniability impossible. In that space between what was said and what is claimed, human agency resides in the refusal to outsource truth to those who benefit from its distortion, one time-stamped message at a time.
The phenomenon begins subtly. A project update shared in a team Slack channel suddenly carries an unspoken weight. As colleagues chime in with variations of, "I heard it differently," or "That's not how I recall it." What feels like casual alignment is, in fact, the quiet mobilization of what psychologists term flying monkeys. Third parties enlisted, often unwittingly, to reinforce a distorted narrative. Your manager might casually mention in a group meeting, "Sarah seems stressed about timelines," planting doubt about your reliability, while peers absorb and echo the framing without verifying facts. This isn't a conspiracy, but calculated social engineering, exploiting workplace norms of consensus and deferential to authority. Historically, such tactics mirror 19th-century factory foremen who cultivated loyal workers to monitor peers, transforming collective spaces into arenas of silent surveillance, a practice modernized through digital collaboration tools where misrepresentations spread faster than corrections. Consider the email thread where your documented agreement is reframed as Sarah's misinterpretation, then echoed by two colleagues who attended a meeting they never actually joined. The gaslighter's genius lies in making dissent feel socially costly. Challenging the narrative risks appearing divisive in a culture that prizes harmony over truth. Philosopher Judith Butler's work on performativity illuminates this. Repeated assertions, even baseless ones, gain power through communal repetition, reshaping reality itself. The isolation isn't merely emotional, it's epistemological, as your version of events loses airtime in shared channels. Yet agency emerges not in grand rebuttals, but in quiet, precise acts, forwarding the original approval email to all parties with "for alignment," or noting discrepancies in meeting minutes before group edits occur. These aren't defensive maneuvers, but restorative ones, akin to labor organizers' historical use of parallel record-keeping to counter management's official logs. What unsettles most is the ambiguity. Colleagues may genuinely believe the narrative,
having absorbed it through fragmented cues. There's no certainty here, only the choice to document not for confrontation, but to preserve a thread of verifiable truth. History shows oppressive systems thrive when narratives go unchallenged in mundane spaces. The water cooler, the shared dock, the after-meeting huddle. Reclaiming agency means recognizing that isolation is the gaslighter's goal, and connection, however cautious, is the antidote. It requires naming the pattern without accusation. I notice our recollections differ. Let's refer to the project tracker. In that space between what's said and what's shared, resistance lives in the refusal to let others script your reality, one carefully witnessed moment at a time. The battle isn't against individuals, but against the quiet surrender of collective memory to those who weaponize it. The constriction in your throat before speaking up is the first betrayal, not of others, but of yourself. You rehearse a correction in the elevator, then delete the draft email with the thought, maybe I misheard. It's not worth the awkwardness. This self-silencing isn't caution. It's the ultimate victory of the gaslighters. Their initial distortions have rewired your internal dialogue, transforming you into the chief auditor of your own reality. Where they once said, you're oversensitive, you now whisper it to yourself while rereading a neutral email, scrutinizing your punctuation for hidden instability. Historically, this internalization mirrors what C. Wright Mills termed the private trouble of systemic issues, when workplace power imbalances become internalized as personal failings. Victorian-era factory supervisors blamed workers' nervous dispositions for injury rates later proven structural. Today, we blame our anxiety for navigating deliberately opaque communication. Consider the project where shifting deadlines becomes your poor time management until you start apologizing preemptively for hypothetical delays. Philosopher Kate Abramson observes that gaslighting succeeds when victims adopt the perpetrator's framework as their own moral compass, mistaking compliance for competence. The true erosion occurs in mundane moments, declining lunch invites to avoid emotional conversations, or reframing a colleague's vague criticism as constructive, despite the knot in your stomach. This isn't weakness, it's the logical outcome of environments where dissent risks social capital, as sociologist Erving Goffman noted in his studies of institutional conformity. What makes self-gaslighting insidious is its self-sustaining logic. The more you doubt yourself, the more proof you generate of your unreliability. Yet agency emerges not in erasing doubt, but in naming its origin. It might mean journaling not to fix your reactions, but to trace patterns. Each time I'm called difficult, it follows my refusal to absorb unreasonable scope changes. This mirrors labor organizers' historical use of consciousness-raising circles to distinguish personal failing from systemic pressure. There is no sudden liberation here, only the quiet discipline of pausing when self-doubt arises to ask, whose voice is this? History shows that oppressive systems depend on voluntary participation in one's own diminishment. Resistance begins by reclaiming the right to be uncertain without self-punishment. The throat's constriction remains, but you learn to recognize it not as a sign of your fragility, but as evidence of an environment demanding too much silence. In that recognition, however fragile, lies the refusal to outsource your judgment, one hesitant but deliberate breath at a time. The work isn't to silence the inner critic, but to remember who taught it to speak.
The meeting room hums with the low thrum of consensus as you hesitate to correct the misstated deadline. Your instinct to clarify feels suddenly disruptive
in a culture that equates silence with professionalism. This is where gaslighting finds its foothold, not in overt hostility, but in the quiet exploitation of your commitment to being a team player. When you note a discrepancy in the project scope, the response isn't denial, but a gentle reprimand. Let's keep this positive. We're all on the same page, right? The message is clear. Defending your reality is framed as creating conflict, while their distortion preserves harmony. Historically, this tactic mirrors the mid-20th century corporate idealization of the organization man, as sociologist William H. White documented, a culture where conformity was professionalism and dissent was uncollegial. Today's knowledge economy repackages this under collaboration rhetoric, where Slack channels and agile ceremonies become stages for enforcing narrative control. Consider the colleague who reframes your documented concern about workload as not being solution-oriented, subtly casting your boundary setting as a failure of team spirit. Philosopher Nancy Fraser notes how such dynamics weaponize progressive values, turning inclusion into a tool to silence those who challenge power. The true cost emerges in daily compromises, swallowing inaccuracies to avoid rocking the boat, or apologizing for adding tension when requesting clarity. This isn't mere politeness, it's the internalization of a false binary, where either you comply or you're deemed difficult, a trap particularly ensnaring women and minorities conditioned to prioritize relational harmony. Yet agency resides not in rejecting teamwork, but in redefining it. It means reframing your contribution as strengthening the team. Like, let's keep us aligned, let's document this decision in the shared tracker. Or, I'm flagging this risk because I want us to succeed. This language, as management scholar Joan Williams observes, leverages organizational values to reclaim space for truth-telling. History reveals these patterns as cyclical, not new manipulations, but old hierarchies draped in modern jargon. There is no certainty in navigating them, only the deliberate choice to distinguish between healthy collaboration and coerced compliance. When the urge to self-censor arises, pause to ask whose version of team benefits from thy silence. In that moment of reflection lies the quiet resistance, recognizing that a functional team needs diverse perspectives, not uniform acquiescence. The gaslighter's power depends on your willingness to mistake self-erasure for professionalism. Reclaiming agency begins by understanding that protecting shared reality isn't drama, it's the bedrock of genuine collaboration. One calibrated question, one documented agreement, one refusal to equate truth with disruption. These are the unglamorous acts that rebuild trust, not in others, but in your own right to participate fully. The team player ideal was never meant to demand your invisibility. It was meant to make your visibility matter.
It is not uncommon in hierarchical workplaces for individuals in positions of authority to engineer or exacerbate problems they later appear to resolve, thereby reinforcing their perceived indispensability. This subtle manipulation often unfolds without overt declaration, through delayed approvals, withheld information, or the assignment of unrealistic timelines, creating conditions ripe for failure. When the project stumbles, the same person who contributed to its instability emerges with a solution, repositioning themselves as the competent leader while casting subordinates as ineffective or disorganized. The effect is both disorienting and insidious. Employees may feel gratitude toward the very person who undermined them, mistaking intervention for leadership rather than recognizing it as performative control. This dynamic echoes what philosopher Ivan Illich described as institutional overreach, systems that generate dependency by manufacturing crises only they can resolve. In the office context, such behavior distorts accountability and erodes trust, replacing collaborative problem-solving with a theater of heroism. It also reflects broader historical patterns in bureaucratic power, where authority is maintained not through transparency, but through managed scarcity of resources, information, or time. Consider how, during periods of industrial expansion in the 19th century, managers often restricted worker knowledge to preserve hierarchy, ensuring that only a select few could fix inevitable breakdowns. Today's corporate variants operate similarly, albeit more subtly. What makes this pattern particularly difficult to confront is its ambiguity. There is rarely proof of sabotage, only a growing sense of unease among those on the receiving end. Employees are left questioning their own competence even as systemic flaws go unaddressed. Yet within this uncertainty lies agency. Recognizing these cycles does not grant immediate power to change them, but it allows for critical distance, a space to observe, document, and, when possible, resist. As sociologist C. Wright Mills argued, understanding the interplay between personal experience and larger structural forces is the first step toward meaningful action. In the quiet moments between meetings and emails, an employee might begin to see not just their shortcomings, but the systems designed to highlight them. That awareness, however fragile, is where autonomy begins.
There is a particular kind of silence that follows the words, "That never happened." Not the silence of absence, but one charged with erasure. It often comes after a direct conversation, an instruction given, a promise made, a conflict acknowledged. Then, later, when referenced, it is cleanly disavowed. The denial isn't tentative. It's delivered with calm certainty, as if recalling a fact rather than inventing one. In that moment, the ground beneath experience shifts. You begin to wonder, did I mishear? Was I mistaken? Could my memory be so flawed? This is not merely a disagreement over facts. It is an assertion of control over what counts as reality itself. Psychologists call this gaslighting, but the mechanism extends beyond individual pathology into the structure of institutional power. When authority figures routinely dismiss first-hand accounts, they replicate a dynamic long observed in colonial and authoritarian systems, where official records overwrite lived experience. As historian Michel Rolf Trouillot noted, silencing doesn't always require censorship. Sometimes it's enough to control which narratives are deemed credible. In the office, credibility is currency. A manager who says, "that never happened," isn't just denying an event. They're shaping the boundaries of acceptable truth within their domain. Over time, employees learn to second-guess not only their memories, but their right to speak them. They may stop documenting conversations, avoid raising issues, or internalize the idea that their perception is inherently less valid. This erosion is gradual, almost bureaucratic, a slow calibration of self-doubt. Yet within this tension lies a quiet form of resistance, the decision to keep a record, to name the contradiction, to trust one's own mind, even when it's contested. Philosopher Hannah Arendt warned that totalitarianism begins not with violence, but with the destabilization of shared reality. In the modern workplace, no such extreme is at play, but the micro-level repetition of denied experiences chips away at collective clarity. There is no dramatic showdown, only a steady narrowing of what can be safely said and believed. But awareness of the pattern, its history, its function, restores a measure of agency. To recognize the phrase for what it is, not an error, but a truth claim, is to reclaim the right to see, remember, and speak. That act, however small, becomes a defense of both self and sense.
The quiet dread begins not with a confrontation, but with a calculation. The gap between rent due and the bank balance, the weight of a child's tuition invoice, the unspoken truth that this job is the only one within commuting distance. This is the silent arithmetic of vulnerability, the precise moment when necessity becomes leverage. In the fluorescent lit conference room, when a manager dismisses concerns with a shrug or shifts deadlines without warning, the employee's hesitation to object isn't mere passivity. It is the conscious suppression of instinct, a trade-off measured in survival. The power imbalance isn't always shouted. It hums beneath the surface of ordinary exchanges, like the vibration of an old HVAC system. As economist Karl Polanyi observed in The Great Transformation, markets thrive not on pure choice, but on manufactured dependency, where the illusion of freedom masked the reality of constrained options. Today's knowledge worker faces a subtler iteration. The gig economy ethos has normalized precarity, turning job insecurity into a personal failing rather than a systemic feature. We internalize this, mistaking our rational assessment of risk for weakness. Consider the coffee cup held too tightly during a review. The tremor isn't fear of criticism alone, but the visceral awareness that walking away might mean choosing between groceries and prescriptions. Historically, such dynamics fueled industrial exploitation. Now they're woven into performance metrics and culture fit evaluations. Yet within this tension lies agency, however narrow. It manifests not in grand defiance, but in quiet calculation, documenting interactions, discreetly networking, or simply naming the unspoken truth to a trusted colleague over lunch. Sociologist Irving Goffman noted that even under surveillance, individuals carve out backstage spaces to reclaim autonomy. The office worker who saves pay stubs or researches labor laws isn't naive. They're practicing a form of resistance rooted in historical precedent, recalling how early union organizers used break rooms to strategize. Uncertainty remains. Will speaking up cost the job? Is the alternative truly worse? But recognizing the leverage for what it is, a structural condition, not a personal flaw, shifts the psychological ground. It transforms silent endurance into deliberate strategy. The paycheck may bind us,
but the mind retains the capacity to map the contours of its cage. In that awareness, however fragile, lies the first step toward altering the terms of the bargain.
The lingering effect of gaslighting reveals itself not in crises, but in the quiet hesitation before hitting reply all on an email, the reflexive double-checking of meeting notes, the unspoken question that shadows every new collaboration. Can I trust this? Long after leaving a toxic workplace, the mind remains calibrated to anticipate distortion. A straightforward project update triggers internal alarms. A colleague's casual remark about miscommunication echoes with old tremors. This isn't paranoia. It's the recalibration of one's internal compass after prolonged exposure to manufactured doubt. Psychologist Judith Herman observed that trauma reshapes not just memory, but the very architecture of trust, turning ordinary interactions into potential minefields. In the modern office, where relationships are built on shared documents and virtual handshakes, this erosion is particularly insidious. The gaslighted employee may find themselves over-documenting trivial exchanges, rehearsing conversations, or withdrawing from team discussions, not out of disinterest, but from hard-won understanding that reality itself can be contested terrain. Historically, such psychological fragmentation mirrors the disorientation faced by marginalized groups whose testimony was systematically invalidated. As scholar Patricia Hill Collins notes, the denial of lived experience is a tool of social control as old as bureaucracy itself. Today's knowledge worker confronts a subtler variant, the corporate environment where truth becomes fluid, dependent on hierarchy rather than evidence. Yet, within this vulnerability lies a paradoxical strength. The hypervigilance born of past manipulation can evolve into discernment, a heightened awareness of linguistic red flags. I don't recall that. You must have misunderstood. This isn't cynicism, but a survival skill honed in adversity. Economist Amartya Sen's work on capability theory reminds us that agency persists even in constrained circumstances. The employee who quietly archives communications or seeks third-party validation isn't broken, but adapting. The path forward isn't about erasing the scars of gaslighting, but integrating them into professional intuition. It means recognizing that while one toxic workplace weaponizes uncertainty, the broader professional world operates on mutual reliance, a system where trust, though fragile, remains the only currency that sustains collaboration. Rebuilding it begins not with blind faith, but with the deliberate choice to test reality in small, measured increments. Sharing an idea in a low-stakes meeting, trusting a colleague with a minor task. Each step reaffirms that not all truths are negotiable, and not all hands extended are traps. The damage lingers, but so does the capacity to distinguish between genuine partnership and performative control. A hard-earned wisdom that ultimately serves, not scars, the future. The phrase lands not as feedback, but as erasure. You're making a big deal out of nothing.
delivered with a sigh over a jammed printer or a missed deadline. What begins as a shared inconvenience, a machine glitch, a scheduling error, suddenly becomes evidence of your disproportionate reaction. The shift is subtle but total. The problem dissolves, replaced by your alleged hypersensitivity. This isn't mere dismissal. It's a recalibration of reality, where external events are reframed as internal flaws. Consider the office worker who flags a recurring billing error, only to be told their persistence stems from anxiety rather than accuracy. The printer jam isn't inefficient equipment. It's your inability to roll with the punches. Psychologist Theodore Adorno observed decades ago how authoritarian systems pathologize dissent, transforming structural issues into personal defects, a tactic now normalized in cubicle farms. Historically, such minimalization echoes colonial administrators labeling indigenous resistance as hysteria, or factory owners in the 1920s framing labor protests as unreasonable demands. Today's corporate iteration is quieter but equally potent. By shrinking your concern to a character flaw, the speaker absolves systems of accountability while positioning themselves as the calm, rational arbiter. The insidious outcome isn't just silenced complaints, but a slow erosion of discernment. You begin questioning whether any frustration is justified. Was the delayed promotion truly unfair, or merely a test of your resilience? This self-doubt serves power by conflating vigilance with volatility, ensuring that even legitimate grievances feel like personal overreactions. Yet, within this distortion lies a quiet leverage point. Recognizing the phrase as a rhetorical maneuver, not a truth assessment, creates space for agency. It allows the worker to mentally separate the event, the report was due Friday, from the characterization, you're too emotional. As labor historian Stoughton Lynd noted, power concedes nothing without a documented demand. Keeping a neutral log of incidents, Project X deadline moved twice without notice, bypasses emotional labels entirely. The printer still jams, the deadlines still shift, but the worker now sees the pattern, not their own instability, but a strategy to preserve the status quo. This clarity doesn't eliminate vulnerability, it transforms it. One learns to voice concerns with premeditated precision. Per our agreement on page 3, section 2, not to win approval, but to anchor reality in shared evidence. The goal isn't to stop caring about small things, but to reclaim the right to define what constitutes small. In that reclamation, the mundane, paper jams, calendar conflicts, becomes a training ground for discerning when a problem is truly trivial and when it's a symptom of something worth naming.
The voiceover's purpose is to be calm, soothing, narrative that makes historical topics relaxing and suitable for sleep. The referral form for counseling lands on your desk not as care, but as containment, a quiet directive to medicalize your response to chronic disrespect. When a manager suggests you're stressed after you document safety violations or labels concern about workload as burnout, they transform systemic failure into individual pathology. This isn't clinical insight.
It's a rhetorical sleight of hand where the symptom becomes the disease. Consider the employee who flags inconsistent billing practices, only to be steered toward resilience training, while the flawed system remains untouched. The move is familiar to historians of medicine. In 19th century textile mills, workers reporting exhaustion were diagnosed with hysteria, their legitimate grievances recast as nervous disorders. Today's corporate variant repackages this logic through wellness jargon, as sociologist Robert Crawford noted in his analysis of how burnout discourse shifts blame from exploitative structures to fragile individuals. The insidious power lies in its plausibility. Stress is real. Mental health matters. Yet here, these truths are weaponized to silence critique. You begin policing your own reactions. Is this frustration justified, or am I too sensitive? The uncertainty is deliberate, echoing philosopher Michel Foucault's observation that medical authority often serves to regulate dissent by framing it as illness. For the office worker, this creates a double bind: protest and risk being labeled unstable, or comply and erode self-trust. Yet within this trap lies a subtle form of resistance. Recognizing pathologization as a strategy, not self-diagnosis, allows for recalibration. It means separating the event, a missed deadline, from the interpretation, you're paranoid. Labor organizers in the 1930s understood this, documenting unsafe conditions not as personal complaints, but as objective hazards, thereby bypassing labels of hysteria. Modern parallels exist in quietly archiving emails, noting discrepancies in neutral terms, or seeking peer validation. Did the deadline change, or was I unclear? This isn't a denial of stress, but a refusal to let it obscure the root cause. The referral form remains unsigned, not out of denial, but discernment, a choice to treat symptoms while demanding systemic change. Historically, such awareness has fueled movements from occupational safety reforms to mental health advocacy, where naming the mechanism, gaslighting, pathologization, precedes dismantling it. There is no clean victory here. The next performance review may still brand vigilance as anxiety. But each time you distinguish your reaction from the provocation, you reclaim a fragment of agency. The printer jam isn't your fault. The culture that calls it your problem is. And in that distinction, small, repeated, uncelebrated, lies the quiet work of rebuilding reality on firmer ground.
The realization arrives not with a confrontation, but in the quiet aftermath of a routine task. You're proofreading a report for the third time, fingers hovering over the keyboard, when the thought surfaces, smooth and convincing. If I were more organized, my boss wouldn't need to hover. It feels like your own insight, a private admission of shortcoming. Yet this self-blame is not spontaneous. It's the careful residue of repeated micro-interactions where criticism was framed as concern, oversight as investment, and control as mentorship. Skilled manipulators rarely dictate conclusions. Instead, they plant seeds through selective praise. You're so detail-oriented, unlike others. Loaded comparisons. Some team members don't need constant reminders. Or feigned confusion. I just want to understand why this took so long. Over time, these fragments coalesce into a narrative you internalize. The problem must be you. Psychologist Albert Bandura described this as moral disengagement,
where systems train individuals to shift blame inward to preserve the status quo. Historically, such mechanisms echo industrial-era efficiency experts who framed worker fatigue as laziness, or Cold War corporate training films urging employees to adjust their attitudes rather than question unsafe conditions. The danger lies precisely in the thought's seamless integration into your self-perception. It bypasses resistance because it feels earned, not imposed. You begin policing your own instincts, questioning whether micromanagement stems from your inadequacy rather than a supervisor's insecurity, or if chronic under-resourcing is truly your burden to solve. This erosion of discernment is insidious because it masquerades as growth. Yet within this fog of self-doubt lies a critical pivot point. Recognizing the origin of these thoughts, not as personal failures, but as cultivated scripts, creates space for agency. It transforms the internal monologue from, "Why can't I measure up?" to, "What pattern am I being trained to accept?" Labor historian Kim Phillips Fine observes that corporate power often operates through the quiet reshaping of common sense, making exploitation feel inevitable. But common sense can be reclaimed. The office worker who pauses mid-thought and asks, "Would I say this to a colleague in my position?" begins to dissect the manipulation. Documenting objective conditions, like manager revised deadline 3 times without notice, separates provocation from reaction. This isn't about erasing self-reflection, but redirecting it. Not, "Am I failing?" but "What system benefits from me believing I am?" The path forward isn't grand rebellion, but quiet recalibration, trusting that a thought's familiarity doesn't guarantee its truth, and that the most subversive act may be preserving your right to define your own competence. In that distinction, however fragile, reality reasserts itself.
The moment arrives not with a crisis, but in the mundane rhythm of a Tuesday morning email. You catch yourself writing, "I'll take responsibility for the oversight," even as you recall your manager's abrupt deadline change the Friday before. This self-betrayal feels like professionalism, a necessary grace note in workplace harmony. Yet it is the culmination of a slow, almost imperceptible surrender. The way you've begun excusing lateness in meetings, they're swamped, reframing disrespect as directness, or downplaying your own contributions to absorb the blame for others' errors. Complicity isn't coerced through threats, but cultivated through exhaustion, the quiet calculus of survival, where preserving peace seems less costly than challenging it. Historian E.P. Thompson observed similar dynamics in 19th century mills, where workers internalized grueling conditions as personal failures rather than structural violence. A psychological adaptation to powerlessness that philosopher Simone Weil termed the gravity of evil, the way oppression becomes indistinguishable from self. In today's open-plan offices, the mechanism operates through normalized rituals, the after-hours Slack message met with silence, then a Monday critique of your proactivity, followed by your apology for not anticipating the unspoken. You rationalize it as teamwork, but the pattern reveals a deeper truth. Your labor isn't just producing reports, it's manufacturing your own diminishment. The danger lies in how seamlessly this erodes discernment. When a colleague asks why you covered for a missed client deadline, you hear your voice say, "I should have double-checked," obscuring the manager's last-minute revision. This isn't loyalty, it's the internalization
of others' failures as your moral deficit. Yet within this resignation flickers agency. Recognizing complicity as a learned behavior, not an inherent trait, creates critical distance. As sociologist Arlie Hochschild noted in The Managed Heart, emotional labor becomes oppressive only when it obscures reality. The shift begins in small acts of refusal, documenting decisions neutrally, i.e., per our 10-3 call, scope adjusted to X, or pausing before self-blame to ask, whose interest does this serve? Labor organizers of the 1930s understood this. They reframed individual grievances as collective facts, transforming "I'm overwhelmed" into "workloads exceed capacity per industry standards." Modern parallels exist in discreetly sharing meeting notes with peers or naming patterns without accusation. Deadlines shifted 3 times this month. This isn't about blame, but clarity, a refusal to let others' chaos colonize your conscience. The path forward isn't blameless. You may still apologize reflexively, but each time you identify the script, i.e., I should have been clearer, you reclaim a fragment of autonomy. History shows such awakenings rarely spark revolution. They build resilience. By tracing complicity to its source, a system that rewards silence over truth, you transform self-erasure into quiet testimony. The email still gets sent, but now you see the architecture of your own acquiescence. And in that seeing, however fraught, lies the first step toward dismantling it.
The chill of isolation arrives not in a shouted accusation, but in the offhand remark, "Everyone feels this way," delivered while adjusting a spreadsheet as if stating the weather. Suddenly the room contracts. Your dissent, which moments ago seemed a reasonable query about budget allocations, transforms into evidence of your alienation. This phrase exploits a primal vulnerability, the human need to belong, honed over millennia of tribal survival. In the modern office, where social capital is currency, the suggestion of universal disagreement triggers a silent panic. You recalibrate instantly, not by questioning the claim, but by doubting your own perception. Did I miss the memo? Was the team chat clear? The tactic's power lies in its unverifiability. To challenge it risks confirming your outsider status. Historian Timothy Snyder notes how authoritarian regimes weaponize this fear, manufacturing consensus to stifle dissent under the guise of collective will. Today's corporate variant operates more subtly. A manager insisting the team opposes flexible hours, though no survey exists. Or a colleague claiming everyone finds your presentation confusing, yet no one voices concern directly. The manipulation thrives in ambiguity, leveraging our evolutionary wiring to prioritize social cohesion over factual accuracy. You begin self-censoring, aligning with phantom majorities to avoid the stigma of disagreement. This isn't mere conformity. It's the quiet surrender of critical thought to the illusion of unity. Psychologist Solomon Asch's conformity experiments revealed that even when objective truth is visible, social pressure distorts judgment, a dynamic now amplified in workplaces where dissent risks professional exile. Yet within this engineered uncertainty lies agency, however fragile. It begins not with confrontation, but quiet verification. A discreet coffee break question to a trusted peer. When they said everyone disagreed with the timeline, did you voice concerns? Often the reply is a relieved, "I actually liked your approach."
This micro act of truth-seeking disrupts the manufactured consensus, revealing its hollowness. Labor historian Melvin Dubofsky observed that workers in the 1930s broke employer-enforced silence by sharing grievances in factory restrooms, spaces where everyone agrees could be tested against lived reality. Similarly, the modern employee who gently probes who exactly was consulted shifts the ground from perceived isolation to shared inquiry. The goal isn't to win arguments, but to reclaim the right to discern fact from fiction. You may still feel the old fear when everyone is invoked, but now you recognize it as a lever, not a verdict. History shows consensus is rarely monolithic. It's often a story told by those who control the narrative. By refusing to accept it at face value, you restore plurality to the room. The spreadsheet remains, the meeting continues, but the tyranny of everyone fractures. In that fracture, however slight, autonomy breathes again, not as defiance, but as the quiet insistence that truth belongs to those who verify it.
The resignation email sent at 2:17 p.m. feels less like an ending and more like the first honest transaction in months. For weeks, the pattern held, a missed deadline attributed to your disorganization, a documented agreement dissolved by "I never said that," the slow suffocation of being told your reality was flawed. Reasoning was futile, not because you lacked logic, but because the other party had already declared your perception invalid. As philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre observed, bad faith occurs when we deny our own freedom by accepting false constraints. Staying meant endorsing a game where the rules shifted only against us. This isn't defeat. It's the only rational exit from a rigged system. Consider the steel worker in 1919 Pittsburgh who walked off the shift not to win, but to reclaim the right to define exhaustion. Or the suffragist who left a debate not silenced, but strategically reframing the battlefield. In today's office, the parallel is quieter. Submitting that IT ticket to formally resign, knowing your manager will call it unprofessional, yet understanding that professionalism here meant complicity in your own erasure. The true cost of staying isn't just the immediate stress, it's the internalized lie that your needs are unreasonable. A distortion echoing colonial administrators who labeled indigenous land claims as irrational. History shows such frameworks crumble only when people withdraw consent. As labor historian David Montgomery noted in The Fall of the House of Labor, power depends on participation. You pack your desk not with triumph, but with exhaustion. The weight of realizing you defended a fiction, if I just work harder, while others moved the goalposts. Yet in the act of leaving, agency reasserts itself, not through confrontation, but through refusal. The elevator ride down feels lighter, not because problems vanish, but because the air no longer carries the static of contested truth. This isn't surrender. It's epistemic self-defense. You've stopped feeding the machine that demanded you doubt your senses. Future workplaces will have their own fractures, but now you recognize the critical distinction. Some conflicts can be resolved through dialogue, while others exist solely to validate control. Walking away doesn't erase the scars, it restores the ground from which new boundaries can grow. The real victory lies not in the departure itself, but in the quiet certainty that your perception was never the problem. In that clarity, however hard won, you've already won what mattered, the right to trust your own eyes.
In the quiet hum of an open-plan office, where tasks blur and meetings dissolve into memory within hours, the act of documenting, jotting down a passing comment, archiving an offhand agreement, can seem excessive, even neurotic. There's a subtle social pressure to trust implicitly, to nod along, to let things flow without record. After all, isn't collaboration built on goodwill? Yet this faith in verbal consensus is fragile. Like writing in sand before the tide rolls in, it persists only until the moment someone rewrites history with a straight face. "I never said that," they say calmly in a performance review or budget meeting. And suddenly, the ground shifts. The confidence you carried, the shared understanding you believed was solid, is now suspect, not because facts changed, but because memory diverged. This is when the unglamorous habit of documentation transforms from bureaucratic excess into a quiet form of resistance. It becomes less about control and more about continuity, preserving not just what was said, but the context in which it was said. As historian Timothy Snyder noted in On Tyranny, keeping records is a foundational act of civic integrity. The same applies in organizational life. Institutions, like societies, are vulnerable to revisionism when no one bothers to keep receipts. A saved email thread or a dated notebook entry doesn't shout. It simply exists, a silent witness. Over time, this practice cultivates a deeper awareness. Reality isn't self-evident. It must be attended to, recorded, and revisited. Michel Desserteau described how ordinary people navigate systems of power through small, often invisible acts of agency. Documentation is one such act, an assertion of presence in structures that often erase individual voice. It doesn't guarantee justice, nor does it prevent manipulation entirely, but it offers something more modest and essential, a reference point. In a world where ambiguity can be weaponized and accountability diluted, the simple discipline of writing things down restores a measure of balance. It reminds us that while we cannot control how others remember, we can choose how we preserve our own truth. Not for confrontation, but for clarity.
The morning begins with an email lacking clear deliverables, a project described in broad strokes, a deadline phrased as ASAP, and expectations implied rather than stated. In the fluorescent-lit reality of routine office work, such ambiguity isn't an oversight, it's a deliberate tool. Colleagues or superiors who thrive in this haze benefit from the flexibility it provides. They can later adjust interpretations to suit shifting priorities or deflect accountability. When the inevitable misstep occurs, why didn't you prioritize X? The absence of defined parameters becomes a shield for the questioner, transforming subjective judgment into objective failure. This dynamic echoes sociologist Max Weber's observations about bureaucratic power. Authority often resides not in explicit rules, but in the control of interpretation itself. The worker, meanwhile, navigates a landscape where the terrain shifts beneath their feet, like trying to assemble furniture with instructions printed in vanishing ink. Daily, this manifests in the quiet anxiety of double-checking trivial decisions, or the futile attempt to extract clarity from a meeting where phrases like "let's circle back" replace concrete direction.
Historically, such ambiguity has served hierarchical systems, from colonial administrations obscuring land rights to modern corporations outsourcing risk through vague contractual language. Yet, within this structure, human agency persists not through demanding perfect clarity, a futile hope, but through subtle acts of translation. An experienced project manager might reframe vague requests into provisional checklists, treating ambiguity as raw material to be shaped rather than a barrier. As Michel de Certeau argued in The Practice of Everyday Life, the powerless often reclaim space through tactical improvisation. Here, that means documenting assumptions. Per our chat, I'll proceed on Y basis unless corrected by EOD, to create footholds of mutual understanding. This isn't about winning, but about reducing the friction of uncertainty. The worker learns that ambiguity rarely disappears, but its edges can be mapped. In doing so, they assert that work, like history, isn't merely endured, but actively interpreted, one small clarification at a time. The goal isn't to eliminate fog, but to learn to walk through it without losing direction.
The conference room still holds the stale scent of overbrewed coffee when the comment lands, a remark about your presentation being cute, like a child's finger painting, delivered with a chuckle that signals its dismissal as harmless. In the moment, the sting is immediate, yet the social contract demands a smile. To object would be to lack a sense of humor. Later, when you cautiously name the discomfort, the defense arrives swiftly and rehearsed. I was just joking. Can't you take a joke? This linguistic pivot, as Irving Goffman observed in Frame Analysis, retroactively rewrites the interaction's meaning, transforming a pointed jab into your perceived deficiency. The tactic isn't merely evasion. It weaponizes social norms, casting the recipient as oversensitive for questioning intent. Historically, such rhetorical sleight of hand has served power structures, from Victorian-era banter masking class prejudice to mid-century workplace horseplay obscuring harassment, where ambiguity in tone becomes a shield for the speaker. In today's open-plan offices, it manifests subtly, a teasing critique of workload in a team chat, reframed as camaraderie when challenged, leaving the target isolated in questioning what everyone knows was just fun. This isn't about humor but control. By controlling the narrative frame, the speaker avoids accountability while painting dissent as disruptive. The worker's quiet agency emerges not in confrontation but in recalibration, drawing on Hannah Arendt's insight that power requires recognition. One might respond not by accepting the joke frame, but by naming the shift. I know you meant it lightly, but the impact felt different. It's a small act of historical consciousness, recognizing that unchallenged ambiguities become tomorrow's norms. Over time, this practice cultivates a resilience rooted in observation, noticing how often jokes target the same colleagues, or how deflection follows criticism. Ambiguity here isn't accidental, it's a cultivated fog. Yet within it, clarity is possible, not through demanding perfect intent, but by documenting patterns, such as 3 times this week comments about X were jokes when deadlines loomed, and choosing when to redirect the frame. The goal isn't to police tone, but to preserve the integrity of communication itself, understanding that in the erosion of shared reality, even a well-timed "let's keep it constructive" becomes an act of quiet stewardship.
The afternoon sun glares off a computer screen as you fumble a routine task, misplacing a file, stumbling over a report's key figure, while a quiet voice insists it's your fault. What feels like personal failing may instead be the physiological residue of prolonged gaslighting. Cortisol, the stress hormone, surging through your system after weeks of "Did you really hear that?" or "You're overreacting." Neuroscientist Robert Sapolsky in Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers details how chronic stress shrinks the hippocampus, the brain's memory hub, and impairs prefrontal function, essential for focus and decision-making. This isn't a metaphor, it's measurable biology. In the office, it manifests as forgetting a colleague's name mid-introduction or rereading an email 5 times without comprehension. The cruelty lies in the loop. Gaslighting induces stress. Stress degrades cognitive capacity, and that degradation becomes evidence of incompetence, justifying further gaslighting. Historically, such cycles echo Victorian-era dismissals of hysteria, where physiological stress responses in women were mislabeled as moral weakness. Today, the mechanism is understood, yet the pattern persists in workplaces where accountability is evaded through psychological erosion. An office worker might notice their hands shaking before a meeting where reality will be contested, or how a simple deadline now triggers paralyzing indecision, not from lack of skill, but from a nervous system trapped in survival mode. This awareness, however, holds agency. Recognizing cortisol's role reframes self-blame. The fog isn't character failure, but a biological alarm. One might adjust routines, scheduling complex tasks for mornings when cortisol is lower, or requesting written confirmations to offset memory strain, treating the body as data, not destiny. Philosopher Martha Nussbaum reminds us in Upheavals of Thought that emotions are cognitive. Acknowledging stress as a physical response, not a personal shortcoming, reclaims interpretative power. It doesn't absolve manipulators, but it disrupts their narrative. Over time, documenting these somatic patterns, "I missed 2 deadlines," reveals cause and effect invisible in the moment. The deeper lesson isn't merely self-protection, but systemic insight. Workplaces that normalize chronic stress aren't just toxic, they're actively disabling human potential. Healing begins when we see the body's signals not as weakness, but as urgent testimony demanding redesign, not resignation.
The colleague who volunteers to clarify meeting notes, who attributes miscommunication to their own oversight, who offers extra hours to smooth a missed deadline. This person is not merely conscientious. Their habitual assumption of goodwill, while admirable, creates a predictable pattern exploitable by those who weaponize reciprocity. In the rhythm of daily work, this manifests as the inbox flooded with last-minute requests framed as favors, or the project where scope creeps because saying no feels like failing a trust test. The vulnerability isn't kindness itself, but the accompanying self-blame. If only I'd explained better. Maybe I'm too sensitive. This cognitive habit, as psychologist Albert Bandura noted in Moral Disengagement, allows exploiters to outsource accountability. Historically, such dynamics thrived in systems reliant on unspoken obligation, from feudal labor customs to mid-20th century office cultures where team player
masked expectation of silent sacrifice. The modern iteration is subtler. A manager's offhand, "you're so reliable," becomes a tether, reframing boundary setting as betrayal of communal spirit. What feels like a personal failing, the exhaustion after constantly absorbing others' oversights, is actually systemic design. Yet within this, agency persists not through cynicism, but through recalibrating generosity. Drawing on Erich Fromm's distinction in The Art of Loving between passive sentimentality and active care, one might direct empathy inward. "I'll help, but let's define what done looks like first." This isn't coldness, it's precision. Documenting patterns. 3 times this month, quick asks replaced formal briefings. Transforms vague guilt into observable data. The worker learns their greatest strength, seeing nuance in others, is also their compass for spotting manipulation. Like a fern thriving only in indirect light, goodness requires boundaries to flourish. Over time, they recognize that true collaboration demands mutual vulnerability, not unilateral surrender. The exploited niceness wasn't the flaw was believing goodwill alone could sustain integrity in asymmetrical power structures. Healing begins when "I'll handle it" shifts to "let's clarify ownership," not to hoard control, but to honor that trust, like any resource, degrades without mutual stewardship. In this recalibration, the office worker reclaims their moral clarity, not as a shield against others' flaws, but as the foundation for work that endures.
The photocopier jams precisely when you need it most, and your manager sighs. You always cause delays, though you've merely pressed the start button. This accusation that you embody the very flaw they project arrives not as a reasoned critique, but as an emotional reflex, a psychological sleight of hand perfected over centuries. Historically, such projections structured hierarchies long before modern offices existed. 19th century factory supervisors blamed workers for machinery breakdowns they'd neglected to maintain, framing systemic failure as individual moral deficiency. Today, the mechanism operates more subtly. A leader, anxious about their strategic vision, labels a meticulous colleague rigid, or an overwhelmed peer insists you're disengaged for not absorbing their unspoken stress. Philosopher Paul Ricoeur, in Freud and Philosophy, described this as the hermeneutics of suspicion, where one's inner turmoil is externalized as another's fault, transforming private insecurity into public judgment. For the office worker, this manifests in the disorienting gap between self-knowledge and assigned identity. You know you're thorough, yet the label slow sticks like ink on cheap paper, warping your self-perception through sheer repetition. The cruelty lies in its self-fulfilling logic. As you second-guess your pace to disprove the charge, real delays emerge, validating the projection. Yet within this distortion, human agency flickers. Recognizing projection as a mirror, not a verdict, allows recalibration. Instead of internalizing "you're disorganized," note the accuser's perpetually cluttered desk, their missed deadlines disguised as your shortcoming. This isn't cynicism, but forensic observation, akin to historian Natalie Zeman Davis's work on early modern slander trials, where accusers often revealed their own transgressions through allegations.
Documenting patterns. 3 unreliable claims followed my refusal to cover their tasks transforms subjective attacks into objective data, separating their anxiety from your competence. Over time, this practice cultivates a quiet resilience, understanding that projection says more about the projector's fragility than your worth. It doesn't eliminate the dynamic. Power imbalances persist, but it restores interpretive sovereignty. You learn to hear accusations not as truth, but as signals. This reveals where they feel exposed. The deeper work isn't defending yourself, but refusing to participate in their narrative, redirecting focus to tangible outcomes. Let's align on the deadline, rather than contested character. In doing so, you reclaim the fundamental truth they obscure. Competence isn't defined by the insecure, but by the consistent, quiet work that endures beyond their noise.
The phrase lands mid-conversation over lukewarm coffee in the break room. After all I've done for you. It arrives not as gratitude, but as a tether, transforming routine mentorship or a single approved vacation day into an unpayable debt. In the moment, the worker feels the familiar constriction, not of overt aggression, but of moral obligation weaponized. This isn't generosity. It's what anthropologist Marcel Mauss termed the poisoned gift in The Gift, where reciprocity becomes coercion. Historically, such dynamics structured feudal patronage and colonial labor systems where benevolence masked control. Today, it surfaces as a manager citing past flexibility to justify last-minute weekend demands, or a peer invoking shared overtime to deflect criticism of their own errors. The trap lies in its false accounting. Professional courtesy, like approving leave or offering guidance, is reframed as personal largesse, creating a deficit the worker can never settle. Psychologically, it exploits our innate sense of fairness. Refusing feels like ingratitude, even when the favor was standard practice. The worker's internal calculus fractures. Did I truly owe more? Was that promotion a gift or earned recognition? This uncertainty, as Hannah Arendt noted in The Human Condition, is where power consolidates, by eroding the line between transaction and tribute. Yet agency emerges not in rejecting the past, but in reclassifying it. One might mentally annotate the ledger. Covered her shift, March 12. Approved my training, April 3. Such quiet bookkeeping, inspired by labor historian E.P. Thompson's work on moral economies, reveals the imbalance. It transforms vague guilt into measurable exchange. Over time, the worker learns not to respond with defensiveness, but precision. I appreciate your support on the X project. For Y task, let's align on scope and timeline. This reframes the dynamic from debt to collaboration, refusing to let past actions distort present boundaries. The deeper insight isn't cynicism, but clarity. Professionalism thrives on mutual respect, not emotional bookkeeping. Recognizing these phrases as relics of hierarchical thinking, not personal failing, allows the worker to disentangle care from control. They understand that true reciprocity requires no reminders, and that no one's dignity should be mortgaged to another's narrative of sacrifice. In documenting such moments, 3x this quarter, after all I've done, preceded scope creep. They reclaim the narrative, turning exploitation into evidence of systemic flaw rather than personal deficit. The path forward isn't repayment, but resetting the terms.
Work as a series of clear, consensual exchanges where yesterday's effort illuminates tomorrow's standards, not shadows.
The ergonomic chair still holds the imprint of your body from hours spent drafting reports you once believed in. Yet the person who sat here confidently a year ago feels like a stranger. This isn't mere nostalgia. It's the quiet erosion of self-trust after sustained gaslighting or manipulation, where the instinct to speak up, the ease of collaboration, even the simple assurance that your memory serves you, all recede like tide-washed footprints. Historically, such identity fragmentation mirrors accounts from Victorian factory workers documented by E.P. Thompson, who described how relentless oversight transformed skilled artisans into hesitant laborers, their professional selves unmade by systems designed to erode autonomy. Today, the mechanism is subtler. A manager's offhand dismissal of your ideas trains you to preemptively silence insights, or a peer's chronic blame-shifting rewires your reflex to assume fault. Psychologist Judith Herman in Trauma and Recovery identifies this as the second stage of trauma, entrapment, where the victim internalizes the abuser's narrative until their own competence feels alien. You catch yourself rereading emails obsessively, not for clarity, but to confirm reality hasn't shifted again. The confident presenter who once led meetings now hesitates to claim space in a Zoom call. This grief is uniquely isolating because it mourns a self others never witnessed, the version unburdened by second-guessing, the one who trusted their judgment without forensic documentation. Yet within this loss lies the seed of agency. Recovery isn't about resurrecting the past self, but architecting a new foundation. It begins in microscopic acts, scheduling 5 minutes to voice an unpolished idea in a low-stakes meeting, then noting the absence of catastrophe, or consciously reframing "I must be wrong" as "this feels uncertain. What evidence would clarify it?" Philosopher Martha Nussbaum's work on vulnerability reminds us that trust, once shattered, rebuilds through incremental risk, not blind faith, but calibrated exposure. Documenting small victories, spoke without apology in Team Sync, no correction needed, counters the brain's trauma-induced bias toward negative outcomes. The path isn't linear. Some days the old self feels further away. But each choice to act despite doubt, submitting a draft without triple-checking, or pushing back on a vague deadline, reclaims territory. History shows exploited workers, from the Luddites to modern union organizers, rebuilt agency not through solitary resilience, but by naming shared patterns. Your quiet recalibration is kin to that tradition, a refusal to let another's distortion define your reality. The grief remains, but it no longer charts the course. You learn to hold the loss gently while building anew, brick by quiet brick.
The manager's voice remains steady as they explain why your report lacks strategic vision. Their expression one of patient concern rather than malice. To them, this isn't criticism, but a necessary course correction. They are the diligent steward rescuing a project from your perceived shortcomings. This self-perception isn't deception, but a deeply internalized narrative where every accusation becomes proof of their own virtue. Sociologist Irving Goffman described such framing in The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. We all curate our roles to maintain coherence, reshaping reality to fit our desired identity. The gaslighter doesn't see themselves as the antagonist, but as the overburdened hero navigating your resistance or inconsistency. Historically, this dynamic fueled colonial administrators who viewed exploitation as civilizing missions, or 1950s corporate managers who pathologized dissent as hysteria in women employees, all convinced their actions served a higher order. In the modern office, it manifests as a peer insisting you're too sensitive after undermining your proposal, genuinely believing they are fostering resilience. The disorientation for the target lies in this sincerity. When someone's conviction radiates calm certainty, doubt naturally migrates inward. You find yourself questioning why you feel attacked when they claim only to care deeply. This isn't mere manipulation, but cognitive insulation. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman's work on cognitive ease explains how the brain favors coherent stories over contradictory facts. Your manager's narrative of your incompetence fits neatly into their self-image as the decisive leader, making evidence to the contrary psychologically uncomfortable to process. The tragedy is its self-reinforcing logic. Your hesitation, born of their erosion of confidence, becomes proof of the very flaw they allege. Yet recognizing this pattern unlocks quiet agency. It shifts the focus from changing their story, which is nearly impossible, to documenting objective discrepancies. June 3rd praised draft. June 10th called it unworkable after I declined weekend work. Historian Timothy Snyder warns in On Tyranny that authoritarianism thrives when victims internalize the oppressor's narrative. Resisting begins by naming the frame. You learn to observe without absorbing. Their need to be the hero explains their actions but doesn't validate them. This distinction is crucial. It doesn't excuse harm, but disentangles their insecurity from your worth. Over time, you recalibrate responses, not to win arguments, but to anchor interactions in observable reality. I recall different outcomes on X project. Let's review the data. The deeper insight isn't cynicism, but clarity. Everyone crafts narratives to survive, but integrity lies in revising them when confronted with truth. Your power emerges not in battling their delusion, but in steadfastly recording what is, a practice as old as the medieval guilds that kept meticulous ledgers to counter merchant fraud. In honoring your own perception, you reclaim the most radical act, refusing to star in someone else's story. The path forward isn't forgiveness, but fortification, building a reality so well documented, so calmly asserted, that their narrative loses its grip.
The cardboard box sits half-filled on the desk, holding only the essentials: a framed photo, a stress ball, and the ergonomic mouse that never quite fixed the wrist ache. This isn't the dramatic exit of corporate law, but the quiet surrender after months of being painted as the problem, the difficult employee, the unreliable teammate, the one whose memory can't be trusted. History offers no comfort here. In the 1930s, labor organizers documenting unsafe conditions were branded agitators. In the 1980s, Whistleblowers exposing corporate fraud faced ostracism long before legal vindication. The pattern persists. When power aligns against truth, the system often rewards the manipulator. Your meticulously documented timeline of shifting deadlines, your saved emails contradicting their claims, none of it matters when the narrative has already calcified in the team's perception. The bitterest lesson isn't that they win, but that the game was rigged from the start. As Hannah Arendt observed in The Origins of Totalitarianism, tyranny thrives not through brute force alone, but by eroding the shared reality that allows accountability to exist. When trust is weaponized as a currency they control, evidence becomes irrelevant. This isn't defeatism, but clarity. The workers' agency shifts from seeking justice, which the structure denies, to preserving the self. It means recognizing that walking away isn't fleeing, but refusing to let their distortion define your worth. Psychologist Viktor Frankl, in Man's Search for Meaning, noted that even in utter powerlessness, one retains the freedom to choose one's response. Here, that choice is mundane, yet radical. Updating your resume on a lunch break, scheduling therapy appointments between meetings, or simply breathing deeply in your parked car before walking in to another rigged conversation. The victory lies not in changing them, but in the deliberate act of self-preservation, reclaiming cognitive space to notice the office plant thriving on your windowsill or the colleague who still meets your eyes. Historian Rebecca Solnit reminds us in Hope in the Dark that progress is often invisible, measured in small acts of resistance rather than grand victories. Surviving their campaign intact, with your moral compass recalibrated but not broken, becomes the quiet triumph. You learn that integrity isn't proven by winning battles, but by refusing to let the battlefield poison your soul. The path forward isn't paved with apologies from them, but with the steady rebuilding of trust in your own perception. One honest conversation. One boundary set. One morning you wake up without rehearsing yesterday's arguments. In this, you honor the oldest labor truth. Sometimes, the most revolutionary act is to walk away with your dignity intact, carrying only what you need to begin again.